The world has changed a lot in recent months. It's probably an understatement. Don't worry, I'm not going to stand up here and list everything that has changed. I think we're all well aware that this past few months have caused changes that we could have never imagined. One of the things that's changed, and that personally I have missed, is sports. I know it's not the most important aspect that this pandemic has affected, but still, I've missed them, and they're starting to come back. But in the meantime, how did I cope? Well, I had to find a new sport to watch, to love, to get invested in. One that is, and always has been, pro-physical distancing. One where egos and ridiculous salaries are minimized, and athleticism, sportsmanship are really elevated. Forces clash, and the best competitor that day comes out victorious. Here's a quick clip.
Savage Speedway. As we saw in qualifying, this track has not been kind to the Savage Speeders. Our grid lined up and ready to go. It's the O'Rangers at the start, lights are on, and we're rolling! Around the turn. The O'Rangers lead coming off the grid. They nearly all at the front, opt to the outside. 10 laps in this race, and the O'Rangers got a bad jump off the ramp. They fall back to third place. Galactic and the Hazers are up in front. Snowballs in fourth, hounding the top three. Outside of Galactic, way up front as we enter the front stretch for the first time. Looks like we do have a couple that come through the pit lane. No real penalty for doing that, but the field locked as they come up the conveyor belt for the first time. Galactic out in front. Team Primary makes the jump to second place. And then nearly fending off a challenge there on the inside by the Hazers, and now they fall back, getting completely swarmed on the inside. The O'Rangers are fighting back just a little bit. Snowballs up into second now. Galactic have lost that giant lead that they had down the front stretch on lap number 1. Coming across in lap number 2, we do have a lead change. The Snowballs out in front. They drift to the inside to try to block. Now back to the outside. Contact between Galactic and Primary across the line to end lap number 2. Hazers up into fourth. Mellow Yellow make an appearance up into fifth.
That's right, marble racing. Everyone's favorite sport. At least, my new favorite sport. It's the perfect pandemic sport, really. It's wholesome while still being competitive. You can root for your favorite team, go Limers. And there's even different variations on it. The one you just watched was called Marbula 1, kind of a playoff of Formula 1 racing, where the marbles race around the track to then get to the end to a conveyor belt made of connects that then starts them on the next lap. And so the competitors race through the track, and at the set amount of laps, the first one to finish becomes the winner. If you've not watched any marble racing, I highly recommend it. Great pastime. But one of the aspects about Marbula 1 that had me thinking this week was the fact that those marbles are basically trapped in this endless cycle. As soon as they reach the end, that just means it's time to take the conveyor belt back to the beginning again, start all over. They keep going around and around and around, around and around. The path is always the same, although maybe navigated slightly differently. I was thinking about being stuck in cycles, because this week we're going to look at a text where we have two very different reactions to the world that involve enforcing and creating these habits that we see and repeat and get stuck in. Sometimes these cycles are destructive, but other times they're exactly what we need. As we continue our series of Unraveled, Seeking God When Our Plans Fall Apart, today we'll be learning from someone who knows what it feels like to have their life fall apart. To be in a place where it feels like everything they know is unraveling. To feel the weight of grief pressing in on their every breath. Today, we're going to learn from Rizpah. Now, if you're wondering who, or maybe what that is, you aren't alone. To be honest, I couldn't have told you a single thing about Rizpah until I started preparing for this morning. She is an incredibly minor character in an incredibly understudied book, 2 Samuel. She's mentioned only twice in the Bible, both in 2 Samuel, and we don't have an account of any of the words she said. But she does have a name, so that's something, and that's a big deal, especially for women in the Bible. The main story in which she appears, which we'll look at today, isn't talked about in any Sunday school curriculum that I've ever seen. It's a sad reality. But Rizpah isn't well known. But that doesn't mean that she isn't worth knowing. So we're going to spend some time with her now. Her story is one of pain and suffering. There is injustice, piled on injustice, and a leader who can't seem to lead without messing things up and making them worse. We can see how easy it is to get stuck in this cycle of injustice. This is also a story about perseverance and hope and a refusal to just stand idly by when injustice happens. Ultimately, this is a story about love and lament, which are directly linked. It's a story of an act of hope, and it's from this hope that we see a cycle of lament and love, which is in direct contrast to injustice. This is a story that both looks completely foreign to us and speaks to us in ways that help show us that we're not as far removed from these cycles of injustice as we might hope. I think that all seems pretty heavy. So let's take a step back. Let's breathe a little. We have to remember to breathe when life gets heavy. Now is no different. So before we can talk about Rizpah's story, we need to know where in the world and when in the world our story takes place. Since most of us are not scholars on the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, but if you are, I would love to talk to you. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of give us a primer on what's going on in the history of Israel. Where does the story kind of take place? So here's a great summary from the Bible Project. If you haven't checked out their videos, they're phenomenal. Really well done, beautiful. You'll get to see one here. So let's learn a little bit more about the world of 2 Samuel.
The book of 2 Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and a blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prize soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister Tamar, and then their brother Absalom finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches the secret plan to oust his father David from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness, except this time he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, when it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin.
So this is right where we enter the story, right at chapter 21. We have King David, the same David from the stories with Goliath and Bathsheba, the same David who authored countless psalms. That David is in a bit of a pickle. And if we know anything from David's past, it's that when things get tough, someone's probably going to die, and it will probably be David's fault. And this story is no different. We're nearing the end of King David's reign, and it is abundantly clear that he is not the perfect king, nor the perfect model for following the commands of God. The country is in a dire condition. There's a famine. People cannot go on like this. The country can't survive like this. I think we have a sense for what that might feel like in light of everything going on. So with all of this in mind, let's read our passage for today. 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14. There was a famine during David's reign that lasted for 3 years. So David asked the Lord about it, and the Lord said, "The famine has come because Saul and his family are guilty of murdering the Gibeonites." So the king summoned the Gibeonites. They were not part of Israel, but were all that was left of the nation of the Amorites. The people of Israel had sworn not to kill them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to wipe them out. David asked them, "What can I do for you? How can I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's people again?" "Well, money can't settle this matter between us and the family of Saul," the Gibeonites replied. "Neither can we demand life from anyone in Israel." "What can I do then?" David asked. "Just tell me, and I will do it for you." Then they replied, "It was Saul who planned to destroy us, keep us from having any place at all in the territory of Israel. So let 7 of Saul's sons be handed over to us, and we will execute them before the Lord at Gibeon, on the mountain of the Lord." "All right," the king said, "I will do it." The king spared Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, who was Saul's grandson, because of the oath David and Jonathan had sworn before the Lord. But he gave them Saul's 2 sons, Armani and Mephibosheth, a different one, whose mother was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. He also gave them the 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, the wife of Adriel, son of Barzillai, from Mahola. The men of Gibeon executed them on the mountain before the Lord. So all 7 of them died together at the beginning of the barley harvest. Then Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, the mother of 2 of the men, spread burlap on the rock, and stayed there the entire harvest season. She prevented the scavenger birds from tearing at their bodies during the day and stopped wild animals from eating them at night. When David learned what Rizpah, Saul's concubine, had done, he went to the people of Jabesh-Gilead and retrieved the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan. For when the Philistines had killed Saul and Jonathan on Mount Gilboa, the people of Jabesh-Gilead stole their bodies from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them. So David obtained the bones of Saul and Jonathan, as well as the bones of the men the Gibeonites had executed. Then the king ordered that they bury the bones in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, at the town of Zelah in the land of Benjamin. After that, God ended the famine in the land. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. To help us look at what's going on here, I'm going to use a cyclical model that I'm borrowing from the Scottish Development Centre for Mental Health. It includes attitude, action, and consequences. In many ways, this is probably just how people make decisions, but it's also how people get in cycles or in habits, for better and for worse, and how those cycles just keep going. So first, let's start with David. David's cycle of injustice. The attitude, which I believe is the attitude of all injustice, is fear. David is coming to the end of his reign, and he's realizing that he is losing control. Or maybe he's realizing that he never really had control to begin with. The country is consumed with a terrible famine, a state of emergency. So there's a lot of fear, because famines cause untold harm to the land and to the people. But there's also this great fear of the unknown. When you go into the unknown, you risk something. At least that's what I learned from Frozen 2, but I still think it's true. David and all the people have the same questions and fears. When will this end? Why is this happening? Why is nothing working? What will we do? Fear in itself is not bad. It's part of the large emotional spectrum that humans are blessed with as part of God's creation. The problem comes when we make decisions based only on that fear. We're setting ourselves up for disaster when we do that. And that is exactly what David does. God tells him the why of the famine. Saul did some terrible things. But God doesn't tell him what to do about it. This is where David starts to improvise. And there are few things worse in the world than fear-based improvising. And that gets us to the action stage of this cycle. Here, as is so often the case for David, the answer is violence. This next stage of the cycle isn't completely David's fault. The Gibeonites are also to blame here. But the decision-making process was already tainted by fear from the very beginning. So, David decides that something needs to be done about this unjust treatment of these people. So he comes to the Gibeonites with a sense of desperation, which is probably why he's willing to give them whatever they want. The price they settle on in this terrible bargaining scene is 7 human lives. Since Saul tried to end their lineage, they will do the same by going after his children. Not just that, but they want those 7 bodies not to be buried. I don't think it can be stressed enough how important burial was to Israel and the other surrounding cultures. All throughout the Bible, authors make note of where and with whom people are buried. We even see the importance of this with Jesus. Instead of being left out in the open, to the chaos of the world to consume, the body was placed in a proper burial spot. Traditionally, the bodies of these men were hung. So the bodies would be left out for all to see until they were devoured. It is a grim scene indeed. So yes, there is physical violence, but there are layers of violence here that go much deeper. There's emotional violence of forcing families to live with the fact that those 7 bodies will not get a proper burial and, as many believed, would not be welcomed into the afterlife. There's a psychological burden of feeling like those 7 men didn't do anything to deserve this. There's also the fear that's placed into the community that lives are not as safe as they expected. This is the type of act of injustice that tears people and families and communities apart overnight. The consequences of this violence are too clear here. Suffering. And in this case, the suffering of death. These 7 men are murdered, not because what they've done, but in hopes that their blood will appease God's dissatisfaction with Saul's earlier acts and thus end the current famine. Does it work? No. Blood does not counteract unjust acts. In David's eyes, his acts are probably seen as just. And that's part of the problem. When we seek to define justice on our own terms, whatever those may be, we're missing the justice of God's kingdom. Injustice, then, clearly falls outside of God's kingdom, and fear and violence and suffering do not have a place in God's kingdom. Injustice cannot be counteracted with more injustice. These deaths have only created more fear. They're still in a famine, and their plan to fix it didn't work. I would say that nothing has changed, but that isn't true. A lot has changed. Lives have been lost. Fear has increased. That's a big deal. Now they'll be even more motivated by fear for their next action. You can see how this cycle can just keep going from fear to violence to suffering to fear, violence, to suffering. It takes something radically faithful to counteract this cycle of injustice. This is where we find Rizpah, at the intersection of hope and loss, of faith and pain, of love and lament. This cycle begins with loss. For Rizpah, this loss is very tangible and noticeable. Her 2 sons, they have been taken from her, and not because of something she did, or even because of something they did. This seems wrong, and that's because it is wrong. In Deuteronomy, there are very clear laws about children not being put to death for their crimes of their parents. Also, as well as making sure that bodies have proper burials, Deuteronomy 24 and 21, respectively. So Rizpah has legitimate legal complaints to bring before the king. We don't see that, though. Nothing will bring back her sons. Nothing. But the loss that she feels pushes her to do something about it. Her actions are clearly a protest. She doesn't go to court. She doesn't hire someone to get payback. She gets her sackcloth for mourning, and instead of weeping in the privacy of her home, she keeps watch over her sons' bodies. She knows that what was done was unjust. It's outside of God's kingdom. So she's willing to change her entire life. just to protect those bodies until something is done about it. This is a depiction of Rizpah, a modern one, as you can tell by the glasses. It shows the pain, lamenting, that she clearly must feel. Her sons, along with these other men, are hanging there. And while there is nothing she can do to bring them back, there is most definitely something she can do, and she is doing it. Lament is not passive. It is an active love for that which is lost. This image depicts that perfectly. This is a protest rooted in love and selflessness. She is sacrificing her own body, her sleep, her health, just so that wild animals do not desecrate these domains. For some, I'm sure this was seen as ridiculous and useless. If the animals don't get to the bodies, the elements will. And after months of keeping this up, the entire harvest season, surely there was nothing left but those bones. To others, however, it was clear that she was not doing this because it was the easiest or the quickest way to love and lament her sons. The truth is that this was the faithful way. She is forcing herself into the reality of this pain every day, and the entire community sees that. They see that she is unwavering in her commitment to doing the next right thing. So what did this protest of epic proportions lead to? Change. Nothing can bring back her sons. Rizpah knows this. But because of her outward actions of lament and love, people take notice. And eventually, the king finds out. And in a moment of rare clarity for David, he realizes that he messed up and he needs to do something about it. David gathers all of the bones so that they can receive a proper burial, thus completing Rizpah's protest. But there's more to David's actions, because he also gives Saul, a man who tried to have David killed on multiple occasions, and Jonathan, Saul's son, and David's closest friend, a proper burial too. It would appear that everyone deserved a proper burial. Those who were killed for senseless revenge, as well as the former king, whose crimes are to blame for the current state of affairs. They all deserved to be honored, not because of who they were, or what they did, or how they died, but because they were humans, created in the image of God. When God looks on what's been done, the blessing of rain comes, and the famine begins to come to an end. It's worth pointing out that David killing those men didn't solve the initial problem. The end of the famine only came when injustice was acknowledged and something loving was done about it. The point here seems very clear. Revenge isn't the answer. Let me state it a little stronger. Violence cannot be the response to violence. The way to respond to injustice is not more injustice. That defeats the point and multiplies the fear and the suffering. There is no room in God's kingdom for injustice. That means it can't be ignored, and it must be addressed properly. This is a cycle, though, and not an easy one. Because with every change, there is loss. For Rizpah, she has spent months with the sole purpose of protecting these bodies, and now she has to find something else to define her. There's also David's loss of thinking that he was right something he probably needs to be reminded of more. There's also the community, who's now more aware of other injustices, other losses. This pushes them forward to more new, different protests, looking for more change so that the world can grow closer to God. This is an uncomfortable story. It's probably why it's been largely ignored and overlooked. So what do we do with it? For starters, we don't ignore it. Next, we can start to look at the ways we're engaged in those different cycles. I wish I had a really great way to exit the cycle of injustice and enter the cycle of love and lament. The truth is, I don't. If we can learn anything from this story, it's that it takes someone giving us the example to help us escape the pain that we're causing and help us to enter into the lamenting for what's gone in hopes of changing the world around us. This is not something we can do by ourselves. We can't will ourselves to be a Rizpah. We need to walk along Rizpah so that we're changed. Now, this story may feel incredibly foreign to us. We don't often think about, the need for someone's offspring to be sacrificed so that the weather will be agreeable. But I don't want us to move past this story. I don't think it's out of touch. So I think we see this same thinking all too often, especially in the church. Here's the basic formula. Injustice plus injustice equals justice. Sounds a little crazy, but this is essentially what David tried to do. The injustice towards the Gibeonites was counteracted by the injustice trying to masquerade as justice that was killing innocent people. Yeah, add those two together and basically you get justice. And it would be magic because I think that would work. American Christianity has a strong tendency to tell the gospel in terms of this perverse system of injustice. The story goes something like this. There is this terrible injustice against God called sin. And that's why the world is in a terrible condition. The only solution is to kill someone who did nothing wrong. Because this unjust and unlawful death, humans can finally be in full relationship with God. Maybe you've heard something like this before. And there's some truth in there, but I think it misses the point of the gospel. There's no love in that equation. So what if the gospel sounded more like Rizpah's cycle of lament and love, less like David's cycle of injustice? Maybe it'd sound like this. Humanity has lost its full purpose and being because of the effects of sin. In an act of love for humanity and as a lament to everything that has gone wrong, God, in the person of Jesus, is willing to sacrifice his body in an act of protest that the entire world will see. This changes humanity by giving it what it needs to become the full creation it was meant to be and truly turn to God. When that cycle continues, injustice shrinks. It loses power, while love grows and is expressed in new and greater ways. And that's what the gospel is all about. It's good news. If this description of the gospel sounds a little strange to you, I encourage you to sit with it. What about it feels true? Where do you find yourself wanting to push back? Where is God in all of it? I think the thing that we can learn from Rizpah is that when our world is unraveling and there's nothing we can do to change what has happened, a faithful response includes sitting in our loss, standing against the injustices that brought it about, and staying strong till change is evident. We can and should be a people who seek to exit the cycles of injustice at all cost, instead of living into these terrible systems. We need to live in the complexity of love and lament so that our lives are defined by them. So some things to think about. What cycles do you find yourself in now? Do they resemble David or Rizpah more? We all have times when we can't realize what type of cycle we're in. In those moments, I pray we have the wisdom and the support around us to stop and consider what we're contributing to. I think it's important for us to ask what loss we see around us. How are we willing to protest that? I don't think there is any nice, neat formula for how to do this. If anything, we're probably more like David, where it's trial and error, and eventually, with God's help, we'll get it right. Lastly, how do you describe the gospel? Does it sound more like a cycle of injustice or one of love and lament? What needs to change so that our relationship with God looks less like a cycle of injustice, less like that cycle from David, and more like what we see from Rizpah? I think this is a lifelong journey, but one that is worth all the effort we have. I pray that we are able to love and lament more, so that we and the world we live in will be a better, more faithful place. The kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. Let us pray. Lord, be with us in those moments where we don't know what to do, in those times where we are stuck, where we see the injustice. Give us the strength to push back. Help us to embody and fully live in your kingdom each and every day with all that we do. Amen.